All right, now it is time to bring in Arthur Schwartz, the food maven. Arthur joins us on this Monday, just about 99.99999% of the time, and we talk about food, recipes, and more. Good morning, Arthur.
And more.
And more.
And more. Yes, it is. I'm going to go right to it. It's tomato. It's a tomato moment. It is the tomato moment. It's the end of August. If you don't get good tomatoes now, when are you going to get them? I'll tell you, in February. The world of tomatoes has changed so much in, I don't know, maybe just the last decade or so, but certainly in the last 20 years. It used to be, do you remember when tomatoes came in a little cardboard sleeve, covered with cellophane, and we thought that was a tomato, not a golf ball. Nowadays, you have a lot of choices and a lot of different flavors, and surely a lot of qualities. So I don't know where to start because there's so much out there. But let me start with heirloom. This is an umbrella term used for tomatoes that either are susceptible to disease, don't travel well, and I don't know, a number of reasons, more than two or three, that they are not grown anymore, which is why they're called, but they are, which is why they're called heirloom. In other words, they may have better flavor than the ones that came in the sleeve with the cellophane over them. But I must tell you, I don't guarantee better texture, although the ones in the sleeve with the cellophane over them were very good for slicing, especially on a butcher's machine to make sandwiches. And they also traveled very well. So heirloom is this umbrella term, and there are a lot of different heirloom tomatoes. I don't profess to know them all, although I have had good luck with Brandywine, which is something from, as you can imagine, from the Brandywine Valley of Pennsylvania, although they're grown everywhere. Heirloom tomatoes are grown in greenhouses now, and they're not heirloom, meaning they're hybrids. Almost all tomatoes, by the way, these days are hybrids of one kind or another. And another one is, speaking of hybrids, is Campari, Campari. Now, I have extolled Campari tomatoes in the middle of the winter, but now that it's summer, I have to say they're the same. So Campari tomatoes are very reliable, usually greenhouse-grown tomato. Sometimes they're sold as tomatoes on the vine, but in fact they're really what are called in the tomato world cocktail tomatoes. They never get big like for instance, beefsteak tomato, and they're never as small as a so-called cherry tomato. But Camparis are a newfangled tomato, and I'm happy about them because, like in the middle of the winter, they're okay, and they're never mealy. Got to say, they may not be as sweet as you want them to be, but they're never mealy. And let's see. Now we're going to other kind. Since I mentioned beefsteak tomato, which is often called in the markets a New Jersey tomato or just a Jersey tomato. Whether it's grown in New Jersey or not. And I do think that where things are grown, where various produce is grown, is a big thing. It makes a big difference in the ultimate flavor and quality of that produce. Let me give you an example. In the tomato world, you can buy seeds to grow your own San Marzano tomatoes in Sharon, Connecticut. And you'll get, if you start them inside and get them outside after frost, you'll get tomatoes by the end of the season. However, they won't taste like the San Marzano tomatoes that are grown on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius with volcanic soil. It's not, and 100-degree temperatures all summer. It's not the same. They may be okay tomatoes, I was buying San Marzano tomatoes from a farmer who I'm thinking about it. I'm not sure exactly where he is, so I won't say. But in order for him to be in the New York City green market system, he has to be within 100 miles of New York City, and his Jersey tomatoes don't taste like much of anything. So it depends on where things are grown. Moving on, and by the way, I did buy some produce at the farmer's market 2 weeks ago, 2 markets ago, and I wasn't happy with what I got, and it cost a fortune. And I'm going back to my fancy supermarket where, in fact, they sell some incredible tomatoes at perfectly fair prices, like $2.99 a pound, which is where I have been buying. I'll call them cherry tomatoes, but they aren't necessarily the round cherry. They come in mixed boxes of red, yellow, heirloom cherry tomatoes. What's an heirloom cherry tomato? It's purpley. And mixed shapes sometimes, pear-shaped ones, the grape-shaped ones, and the round ones, so generically I call them all cherry tomatoes. So they sell these in my fancy supermarket around the corner, and it inspired. But the only problem with these tomatoes, they're absolutely delicious, but they have tough skins. So when it was really dog days and I wasn't lighting the stove at all, except to make some spaghetti, of course, I diced these up and made raw sauce with them. Crudaiolo. I mentioned this several weeks ago. To the diced cherry tomatoes, all you really need is oil and maybe an herb, minced garlic. I like to put in there raw garlic. You can add other things. You could add minced celery. I like the little crunch of that. An onion or scallion or even a shallot. Nice raw shallot, minced finely, whatever, raw sauce. But inspired by a column in the New York Times, I guess it was the magazine, by Eric Kim, whom I admire for his fusion Korean food. Mostly I read about his food. I don't actually cook it. Once in a while I cook it. I made his fish sauce butter chicken recently with croutons. It was sensational. So I'm tempted to read everything he writes. In this case, he went to Italy, and I guess he's discovering Italian food. And wherever he was in some place in the north, I'm not sure he even mentioned where he was, but it was obviously the north. And somebody made him the best tomato sauce that he ever had, and it was a puree of tomatoes. At this time of the year, tomatoes are so plentiful you can puree them and not feel like you're destroying something. Anyway, the recipe he ran, he decided to make a combination of different tomatoes to emulate the taste he had in Italy. Of course, the tomatoes in Italy that he had didn't taste like the tomatoes you could buy in Key Food, which is our New York City supermarket chain. So he made up a combination of tomatoes, including, by the way, Campari tomatoes. And then he pureed this nice sauce he made by pushing it through a strainer. Now, so I'm really curious who he learned this from, because that is such an old-fashioned way of making a puree, even for an Italian, even for an Italian who insists on being traditional. And what my Italians would use is a food mill, which is what I use. So you make a sauce, and you want a beautiful puree, and you don't want any seeds or skins. So I decided I'm going to just make a tomato sauce. I wasn't following Eric Kim's recipe, but it inspired me to make a pureed tomato sauce, and I just used these tough-skinned cherry tomatoes, well what a sauce they made. Now, I cut them up, but in my last cookbook, the Southern Italian Table, there's a recipe for smashed tomatoes. So, in fact, smashed tomatoes in the south of Italy, cherry tomatoes that you cook and smash, is such a I don't want to say common thing, but normal thing. Pomodori schiacciati, and also broken spaghetti, spaghetti spezzati. So I was going to call my book Smashed Tomatoes and Broken Spaghetti, but the publisher didn't like that. So it ended up being the Southern Italian Table. Not nearly as poetic. I could also call it breadcrumb cuisine, but that's another story. So all you do for smashed tomatoes, and this makes, believe me, not only a good sauce for pasta, but also a bit wonderful stuff to put on bruschetta, to put on toast. And you could top that with some cheese if you like, but you don't need it. So smashed tomatoes, I cook out some garlic, meaning I smash the garlic actually with the heel of my hand so that it's smushed, and I saute, let's say, for a pint of tomatoes, a heaping pint of tomatoes, I would use 2 cloves of garlic and cook them in, let's say, 3 tablespoons, even a quarter of a cup of extra virgin olive oil. Cook them slowly so that their flavor gets into the oil. I smush them down with the back of my spoon every once in a while. And before they really brown, add all your tomatoes, recently rinsed, so they have water clinging to them. Put them in the pan, raise the heat to high, cover the pan, and shaking the pan with the cover still on. You're going to need a pot holder to hold it on. Shake it like you were making popcorn, and after just a couple minutes, you're going to hear some popping. The tomatoes will explode. As they explode, they give off some of their juices, and that prevents, 1, the garlic from burning or even browning, and 2, it creates a steamy atmosphere so that the more resistant tomatoes start popping. And anyway, it's called smashed tomatoes for a reason. Take the cover off. You may want to lower the heat at this point so it doesn't spit at you. And with the back of your wooden spoon, start smashing your tomatoes. I mean, just a little. If a little pressure on the tomato doesn't do it, then they need to cook a little further. But that's the whole thing. Salt and pepper, if you really care about it. Hot pepper, I do. I put in a little hot pepper, and that's it. Now, what you do with this now is up to you. A macaroni that's going to catch pieces of tomato is wonderful, like shells. If you happen to, this is a good thing for kids, I think. The kids I know, because the kids I know like fanciful shapes of pasta, and this is a good thing to put with fanciful, and they like tomato sauce. Now, when I made my puree, though, I used onion and not garlic. So I cooked my onions slowly in minced in olive oil. A small, just, let's see, for a box of, I wouldn't even use a whole onion for a box of, a 1-pint box of tomatoes. A half of a small onion is enough. Minced, put it in with a few tablespoons of olive oil. Cook it slowly so the onion gets tender. If you see it's starting to color and it's still not tender, you can taste it to know if it's tender. Add a tablespoon of water, an old Southern Italian trick. When you want onion to be tender but not browned or even golden for that matter. And I always used to say in cooking classes when I did them in Italy, if you wanted to taste Jewish, brown the onion. If you wanted to taste Neapolitan, leave it blonde. So that's the difference. Everything starts with an onion, because onions and garlic are the most common foods on earth, literally. So after sautéing a little bit of onion, I then added the cherry tomatoes, and I covered the pan because I just want them to cook. And I didn't cut them up. So after they cook and for a while, then now you can smash them down. And I threw in, only because it was on the counter and I wanted to use it up, one salad-type tomato. So that gave me just enough juice to cook all this together. If you don't have a salad-like tomato to juice it up, don't worry about it. Just keep the pan partially covered or even covered while the tomatoes are cooking so that you don't lose any of their moisture. And then I took out my trusty food mill. I, by the way, used to even puree canned tomatoes. These days I prefer a chunkier sauce, and it doesn't matter, and so I don't bother. But I did, after reading Eric Kim's column, I did want to have a pureed tomato sauce. And so I put it through the food mill, and that was it. That was totally it. Put it back in the pan, and then when my pasta was done, even if you, by the way, use juicier tomatoes, any kind of tomato you can do this with, even if you're using juicier tomatoes and you end up with a juicier puree, in the end you want to cook your pasta, spaghetti, for a pureed sauce, there's nothing like spaghetti. You want to cook it the last minute in the sauce so that it gets really imbued with sauce. You don't need a lot of sauce. You will have enough. One box of tomatoes probably will sauce at least two, but probably 3 bowls of pasta. And I only make 3 ounces of pasta per person. It's not an enormous amount. So, in fact, the other day I made 12 ounces for 4 people, and we couldn't finish it. That's how trained we are to be satisfied with the small amount of pasta. So cook the pasta, the spaghetti or macaroni, whatever you're making, in the sauce for just a minute or two, and it'll taste so much better. Scoop it out. Whatever sauce is left in the pan, you can divvy up between the portions and put that on the top. But that's it. Herbs, if you have some fresh basil, great. If you have mint, use a little of that. I love mint in tomato sauce. If it's the winter, well, you're probably not going to make a fresh tomato sauce in the winter. But if you don't have any fresh herbs in the house, not even parsley, oregano. And dried oregano is fine. It's not fine. It's better than fresh. So that's one kind of tomato sauce. So let me just for a minute talk about the food mill. I bought this food mill maybe 40 years ago. I have another one which I don't use as often. I should probably give it away. But for me, you can't make tomato sauce without a food mill. And I use it for other things too. I use it sometimes to make mashed potatoes. I sometimes use it to puree a soup. I sometimes use it to beans. If I have beans and I want to puree them, like for a soup, or even just for a bowl of beans. A lot of uses, and it comes with 3 different blades. I have never seen a food product. Oh, yes, I have. The Foley food mill, which is the American version of this, does not come with interchangeable blades. It's a pot-shaped thing that just has one grating blade on the bottom. That's it. If you're going to go out to buy a food mill, be sure to get one that has interchangeable blades. Mine has a coarse blade, which I don't use very often, a medium blade, which is what I use most often, and it's the one I would use to make tomato sauce, and the fine blade, which I also don't use very often, but sometimes for a soup, I'll use the fine blade. Sometimes you have to do the coarse and then the fine. Depends on what you're pureeing. But it comes apart, it goes in the dishwasher, and it is so useful. As I said, I use mine all the time. In fact, it's in a very easy to access place in my kitchen because I do want to just reach in and pull it out. Now, let me talk about New Jersey and tomatoes and peaches. So let's start with there's good reason why places that aren't anywhere near New Jersey call their tomatoes Jersey tomatoes, because it's a marketing thing. 99%, as far as I can tell, they're beefsteak tomatoes, which is the large, usually firm, very sliceable, great for salad tomatoes, great for a caprese, speaking of tomato salads, sliced tomatoes and sliced mozzarella, dressed with good olive oil, some basil leaves, can't be beat. That's a salad from Capri or caprese. So these days, a million things are made caprese or alla caprese, which has come to mean with tomatoes and mozzarella. So if you see that on a menu, you know what that means. Anyway, those are the Jersey tomatoes. But somehow, and I don't know how this happened, Jersey now has a reputation for growing great peaches. Gotta say, as somebody who has now been eating Jersey peaches for months, I've yet to find one that was worth the bite, much less pounds. So I mentioned this a few weeks ago, I made this a peach crostata. It was such a hit, I had to make it again. It's always a hit. The recipe I gave on the air, it's also in one of my cookbooks. I think it's in my first cookbook, Cooking in a Small Kitchen. In any case, so that's how long 40-something years I've been making this. I made it again. An essential for me is freestone peaches, because the way I want it to look is with the humps of the peaches sticking out from custard. It's really delicious. So I bought these peaches, which I think they were Jersey peaches for sure, and I thought they might do. And I ate. So I bought enough to have one extra to taste, because I bought them 2 days before I needed them. You know, they need time to ripen. So I taste this, and it was okay. I thought, well, good enough for baking with enough sugar. It'll be okay. Because the last one I made that was so delicious, the peaches were actually tart. They were no way sweet. So I baked it. It ends up, only the one that I ate was really sweet. It could even be called sweet. The other ones that I baked into the crostata were barely acceptable peaches, even though they seemed ripe when I peeled them and cut them. And they were freestone. I didn't have any trouble cutting them in half. So anyway, Jersey now has a reputation, but I would stay away myself. Early in the season we get some nice peaches from the Carolinas. Of course, Georgia is very famous for peaches. The places are famous for these things because of their soil, their climate. I'm not casting any aspersions, except on the marketing people, maybe, who have foisted this idea that New Jersey tomatoes are better than Connecticut tomatoes. The fact is that these heirloom baskets of tomatoes that I've been buying with the tough skins, but they're really delicious, are grown in Pennsylvania. So there you go. Here's a tomato recipe that I keep thinking I should make. I've got to go out today and buy the one essential ingredient, which is double-baked bread. Pane means bread in Italian. Biscottato, which means twice baked. So pane biscottato, layered with tomatoes, oil, vinegar, perhaps tuna, capers, olives. You can make this as elaborate or as simple as you like. Is called caponata, like the Sicilian word caponata napolitana. It's also called other things. I like to call it caponata napolitana, and it's made with. And by the way, the bread, besides being called pane biscottato, is also, and some of you will know this, is called frezzelle, and they're rings. It looks like a half a dried jumbo bagel, and I like the ring. It doesn't matter. They're all good. If you can find it, it's good. It's an imported product. I've never seen it. Oh, in Italian American bakeries, they use at least here in Brooklyn, they used to make their own, and maybe a few still do. But I go to my store, my Italian market, and they have imported from the South, sometimes from Puglia, Calabria, Naples, all these regions use pane and basilicata. All these regions use pane biscottato because you never waste a crumb of bread in southern Italy. So this is actually made to be dried, but if you don't have the real deal, you can do your own. I would say that most American bread does not dry to the right consistency, but every once in a while when I do get a loaf and I don't use it all, I do put it on a baking sheet and let it dry out in a low oven, and it works well enough. But I'm lucky I have access to the real deal. So pane biscottato. So you put this. I love to do this for a party because it looks so good. You put the pane biscottato down on a platter. Now you have to soften it. So I make a saltwater solution, maybe a tablespoon of salt in a quart of water in a bowl. Let the salt dissolve. Swish it around, and then bury the one piece at a time, the dry bread. Maybe it needs 10 seconds, maybe it needs 30 seconds. You're going to have to figure this out. You do not want it to be soggy. You just want it to absorb a little water. The first time you do it, you might not get it right. So, but in the end, you do not want it soggy. You want, and you in fact want a little crunch here and there. So maybe 10 seconds under salt water. Put it on the platter. Fill the platter. On top of that, put a tomato salad, either sliced tomatoes covering everything, or diced tomatoes that you've maybe tossed with some oil and garlic. And if you haven't tossed the sliced tomatoes with anything, drizzle them with oil. Then start garnishing. I like to just break some really good tuna over it, some salt capers that have been soaked in cold water for a while to get rid of the salt. You can put anchovies on, any kind of olives that you like. Bob happens to like this with avocado. So if you have an avocado, you can slice that on top. It makes it very attractive. And then, of course, some herb. I usually just use dried oregano. But if you have some fresh basil, tear fresh basil over it, by all means. And that's it. You can put some vinegar on. Oh, I usually sprinkle, after I've doused the pane biscottato with salt water or just tiny soaking, I then sprinkle vinegar right onto the bread. I don't like vinegar right on the tomatoes, but I do like it on the bread. Oh, here's an ingredient that you could: sliced red onion, or diced red onion, or slivered red onion, or chopped or sliced scallion. That's a nice one. So, and you can do it. This originally was made with fish, and in Baroque days, at the court, the Bourbon court in Naples, they made these very elaborate compositions with pane biscottato, towering, with all kinds of ingredients. You can read about them in the history books. You would never in a million years make them today. Of course, it was made by professional chefs to awe the guests. So you will awe them with the deliciousness of the tomatoes and your good olive oil, and that's it.
All right. Wow, a whole show on tomatoes.
Tomatoes. Well, let me just one thing I did not say, and please never put these tomatoes or sauce in a food processor. I already heard somebody out there in Radio Land saying, "Why is he using a food mill when we have a food processor?" It's not the same thing. You will not get the same texture, flavor, or color. So don't put any tomatoes in the food processor.
All right.
All right. So I hope the weather cracks and,
won't crack till maybe this weekend, maybe.
Maybe. All right. Well, it's actually quite beautiful here right this minute, but I don't trust the minute.
That's right. A minute turns into hours, and then it gets real humid. All right, Arthur, we'll speak to you.
Have a great week, everyone.
Yeah. Do you want to work on the Labor Day itself?
On Labor Day? Yeah, why not? What am I?
Yeah, it's Labor on Labor Day. I'll be here.
I don't know. Are you gonna be live on Labor Day?
Absolutely.
Then I am too.
All right, then I'll speak to you next Monday.
I'll talk to you next Monday.
Take care.
Bye.
Arthur Schwartz, the Food Maven, here on Robin Hood Radio.